My guest at this time is Gordon Chang. He's an East Asia policy expert and the author of The Coming Collapse of China. We've asked him to comment on the rising tensions in Hong Kong, the pro-democracy demands of the demonstrators, and what Beijing is planning to do in response. And, of course, we want to know what he thinks the U.S. position ought to be as this all plays out. We'll discuss it all in the next few minutes, and Gordon, thanks as always for being with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Greg.
You and I have talked about this already this year. We talked back when the protesters were in the streets demanding the withdrawal of the extradition bill, which we can certainly say has not passed. It has been pulled but not officially withdrawn, which is one of the demands of the demonstrators. So without the legislature taking this back up again, why are these huge protests still continuing with the same intensity?
Now they've got the 5 demands, which of course includes the withdrawal of the extradition bill. But really what's happening here in a larger sense is that people in Hong Kong, and not just the pro-democracy kids on the streets, but also a very large segment of the Hong Kong population, just believe that this is their last stand for autonomy. And that's why we don't hear very much carping about the violent tactics of the kids, because most people in Hong Kong, and we're talking 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the people, are focusing more on the brutal tactics of the police, the intransigence of Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong chief executive, the top political officer, and also Beijing's encroachment on their way of life. So this is a society struggle against China.
And the Hong Kong police now that we've seen in recent weeks, more recently certainly, the response has not been as peaceful, and in some cases the protesters have not been as peaceful. Who exactly are the Hong Kong police answering to right now?
I don't think they're answering to the Hong Kong Commissioner of Police. I think that essentially we're seeing Beijing dictate what's going on. And there have been some very interesting videos recently. One of them from about a week ago shows a Hong Kong riot officer. And he's obviously from Hong Kong because he speaks colloquial Cantonese. But then he turns to other riot troops next to him, and he starts speaking to them in Mandarin. And, you know, one Hong Kong police officer would not speak in Mandarin to colleagues. And then the Hong Kong riot officer addresses his fellows with the word comrade. So this follows also some videos which are on YouTube, which show people in Hong Kong police uniforms who, first of all, can't show their Hong Kong police identity cards and who obviously don't understand Cantonese in a Cantonese-speaking city. All of this suggests that China has put in its either People's Armed Police or maybe even People's Liberation Army personnel into Hong Kong streets wearing Hong Kong police officer garb.
So they're already on the front lines. Just because we can't see the actual troops marching in doesn't mean that they're not at the very ground zero of this.
Yeah, these videos suggest that that's the case. I mean, we don't have 100% hard proof on this, but nonetheless, these videos do tell us that in all probability, China is now controlling the Hong Kong police force and has put its people there wearing police uniforms.
What's your assessment, Gordon, of how Xi Jinping and his regime have addressed the protests to date? And I know it's changing, as we just discussed. And what do you see as their plan going forward?
Yeah, Xi Jinping has taken a hard line. Before he became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, he actually had the Hong Kong portfolio on the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest decision-making body in the Communist Party and therefore in China itself. He no longer has that portfolio, but the policies that are being implemented today are his policies. And he's obviously not making concessions that are going to please people in Hong Kong. So Carrie Lam, the chief executive, has been giving a series of press conferences, which are just tone deaf if you think that she is trying to placate Hong Kong people. But she probably doesn't care, because what she's doing is addressing an audience of one. And that audience of one is in Beijing. And that person in Beijing, of course, is Xi Jinping. So he's taking a pretty hardline stance. And right now, it's basically no compromise.
Now, we saw the crowd disperse from the airport when the police came in on Tuesday. How do you expect this to go from here? Do you expect more mass protests and more police clashing with the demonstrators? Or is this going to take on a different element now?
Yeah, I think we'll see more clashes. The protesters are very interesting. They have taken the advice of Bruce Lee, the martial arts a film expert, and they say, be like water, which is what Bruce Lee said. Well, these guys are like water. So, for instance, a couple days ago, when they occupied the Hong Kong airport terminal, and then Beijing said their activities were like terrorism. Well, that frightened them. So what they did was they just left the Hong Kong airport and they protested someplace else in Wan Chai on Hong Kong Island. And then they flowed back into the airport for that famous sit-in, which resulted in the violence that we've all talking about. So these guys move very quickly. They're always one step ahead of the police, and I think that we're going to find that they are going to, engage in protests. China will try and catch them, but for the meantime, Beijing's not having any luck in quelling this at all.
Let's talk about the U.S. position in all of this. On Tuesday, President Trump was asked about this issue, and his comment was, quote, "The Hong Kong thing is a very tough situation. Very tough. We'll see what happens. But I'm sure it will work out. I hope it works out for everybody, including China, by the way." You tweeted that needs to be a whole lot stronger. Why do you think it's not, and what should he be saying?
Yeah, I think he should be saying that the U.S. will impose stern measures on China should it deploy troops of the People's Liberation Army or the People's Armed Police on the streets of Hong Kong. And the reason is that we have a common foe. China is attacking American democracy, and it's attacking the whole notion of representative governance, of democracy itself. And what it's doing in Hong Kong, of course, it's trying to impinge on the freedom of Hong Kong people. So Hong Kong is really our front line. And so to defend our society, we should defend it wherever freedom is jeopardized by the Chinese. And so President Trump's words, he's also said things like, this is just a matter between Hong Kong and China. That is uninspiring and completely inadequate. And President Trump should actually start talking like a traditional American president about our values and what we stand for in the world. We've got to remember that the kids in Hong Kong, they're flying the American flag, they're singing our anthem, they need our help, but we also need their help, and that's why we need stronger language from the White House.
You mentioned this at the top of your last answer, Gordon, but how far should the Trump administration be willing to go publicly or privately in urging China not to crack down here?
Well, I think that we should be telling the Chinese in public and in private that we will, for instance, repeal legislation that gives Hong Kong certain advantages, such as in licensing and exemptions and the rest of it. So those could go away. But also I think that we should be saying to China, look, we are going to put our whole economic relationship on the line, trade, investment, all sorts of commerce, financial flows. We should be doing this anyway for a number of reasons, but Hong Kong gives us an opportunity to use this as leverage. And I think that if the president were to make a statement which was more traditional, then I think the Chinese would back off because they realize that they can't take on the United States across the board at this particular time. So we should be defending ourselves because that would be effective. And I think all the president would need to do would be just to get behind his desk in the Oval Office and tell the Chinese that they stop here.
We're talking with Gordon Chang, East Asia policy expert and author of The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, I'm not suggesting it would be imminent, but if the United States doesn't take a stronger position here, could Hong Kong in some way be a dress rehearsal for Taiwan?
Well, Xi Jinping obviously was thinking along that line, and there is a relationship between the two because before the large-scale protests started in the middle of June, the as it's called, pro-independence forces on Taiwan were really on the back foot. But since we've seen China actually work on Hong Kong in ways that people in Hong Kong don't like, well, people in Taiwan look at this and say, look, no, because Xi Jinping himself has made the connection. Hong Kong has a one country, two systems formula of autonomy. Well, Xi Jinping says one country, two systems is also what he wants for Taiwan. And the people in Taiwan can look at this and say, no, we don't want that at all. And that has led to a couple of things that Xi Jinping didn't like. For instance, Tsai Ing-wen, the president of the Republic of China, of Taiwan, won renomination of the Democratic Progressive Party in this January's presidential election. And she probably wasn't going to get that renomination. And also right now, the candidates of the opposition party, the Kuomintang, have had to drop their pro-China positions, at least in public. And it looks like the Democratic Progressive Party candidate, in other words, the president, Tsai Ing-wen, might actually get reelected, which was not a high probability event before what was going on in Taiwan, in Hong Kong became really clear. So Xi Jinping is, as Chinese propagandists say, he's dropping rocks on his own feet.
Wow. Gordon, I'm sure we'll be talking about this again as events warrant. Thank you very much for your time today. We always appreciate it very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Greg.
You bet. Gordon Chang, East Asia policy expert, author of The Coming Collapse of China. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.